Elijah Ortega. Thank you, Mr. Ortega. This brings us to item 1, which is presentations by the public on matters not on the agenda within the jurisdiction of the commission. Are there any presentations? Okay. Next item is correspondence and staff communications from the Planning Commission Secretary.
Yes, thank you, Chair Berliner. A couple items to note for you. We are currently accepting applications for to be on commissions. Those are due by November 11th, so it'll be here fast. So I encourage everyone to submit your applications to be reappointed for another 2-year term on the Planning Commission. Bring it up only because I think we were putting those out a little bit earlier in the year than has been the case in the past. So I wouldn't want anyone to miss that deadline if you wish to apply to be reappointed on the Planning Commission. Also, Lori Ledesma with the City Clerk's Office is sitting in for Tanya tonight, so we're very grateful for her to be here tonight, and we'll be in good hands with her. That's all for staff communications at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Next up, we have disclosure of ex parte communications. Disclosure of any communications on agenda items received by planning commissioners. Does anyone have anything to disclose? Seeing none. Okay, let's move on to the consent agenda. Consideration and approval of the minutes from the October 6th, 2022 commission meeting.
I'll move to approve.
I'll second.
Moved by Commissioner Hirsch and seconded by Vice Chair Lockhart. Do we do a roll call? Okay. All those in favor? Say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none. Motion passes. Our next item is item number 5, public hearing regarding Resolution 22-3 PC regarding amendments to Title 17 of the Municipal Code and housing element updates to be in conformance with state law.
Yeah, Daniel Baruman, a senior planner on my staff, my newest member of my staff, will be presenting this item tonight. Daniel's been with us for about 4 months, and his focus is primarily on the long-range and advanced planning matters that we bring forth to you, and we're very excited to have him with us for a variety of reasons, but perhaps most importantly is allows us to be hopefully a lot more proactive on many of these matters. There's state legislation that comes down the pike all the time, especially on housing related matters, and I certainly expect that to continue. So I'm excited we can have someone who could be primarily focused on those matters to keep us moving forward here in West Sacramento. So I'll turn it over to Daniel. He'll go to the podium and do a presentation on this item for you.
Well, good evening, Chair, Vice Chair, and all the members of the Planning Commission. My name is Daniel Baruman, Senior Planner for the City of West Sacramento, and I'm here tonight to present on zoning code updates. It's
Bottom one.
bottom. Got it. Thank you, Lori. All right. The zoning code sometimes requires periodic updates to keep up with ongoing changes in the city. So the purpose of this hearing tonight is threefold. Number one, the city wants to remain consistent with state law. This is seen primarily through the 3 housing element programs that we've identified to be updated. Number two, staff wants to both clarify any unclear or ambiguous language in the code, but also amend it so it allows planners and other staff to effectively carry out the mission of the general plan. And number three, treat the zoning code as a living and not a static document. The code sets up parameters to work within, and it's our guide as planners, but we should strive to improve it where we can, and it means hearing from city staff and the community, and this is on a consistent basis to serve residents of West Sacramento. And I'll just go through the 8 proposed changes, starting with applicability to property, fueling stations, paving in residential properties, wind turbines also in residential properties, swimming pools and spas, and then the last 3 are the housing element programs, 6.4, 6.6, and 6.8, regarding, starting with 6.4, emergency shelters in regards to parking, special needs housing, and the definition of family, and lastly, farm worker housing. Starting with applicability, so you note the strike-through language there. The desired intent of this modification is to allow the city greater discretion working with land use holdings that the city owns and operates. For example, the city of West Sacramento would be eligible to allow a primary use of its choosing regardless of land use designation. An example I would give would be, let's say, a communications facility that may require a conditional use permit wouldn't necessarily have to go through that CUP process if the city was to make this amendment. Regarding fueling stations, the intent is to amend the land use matrix to so that all zones which currently allow fueling stations or gas stations by right to be changed to a minor use permit process. Zoning districts which currently allow fueling stations as a permitted use are currently commercial and the mixed use zones. So this modification would allow the city more control in the approval and placement of fueling stations. An applicant would not be permitted by right to develop or construct a station without 1, submitting a land use application, and 2, getting approval from the zoning administrator. Moving on to paving, and you can see here some of the examples I have of some good paving on the good paving examples on the left-hand side, and a not so good example on the right-hand side. The current section of the code states that the maximum amount of impervious surfaces in the street-facing yards is 50% of the required yard. This definition has led to some open-ended interpretations. So we want to clarify it by stating that in the R1, R2, and R2.5 zones, impervious surfaces, including parking, walkways, and paved patio areas, shall cover no more than 50% of the entire front yard that is not covered by a residential structure. And this definition is really reminiscent of a previous interpretation or a previous iteration of the definition that we had in the old zoning code. The rest of that is landscaped or pervious area shall include a combination of well-maintained cover, ground cover, shrubs, hedges, trees, and other pervious vegetation that shall not be paved over. Moving on to residential wind turbines, and you can see some examples here of some residential wind turbines or small wind turbines. Staff has proposed wind turbines to be allowed in all residential zones. The proposed amendment would permit by right wind turbines on all structures and only require a building permit, not subject to design review, not subject to the planning submittal process, provided that they do not exceed the height limits of that particular zoning district. Wind turbines are an additional source of clean energy for residential applicants. Staff proposes that this change be implemented to allow options beyond the use of the current energy grid and the use of fossil fuels, i.e. the use of generators, and this is akin to solar panels on residential properties. Moving on to pools and spas. For pools and spas, the code section states that the pools and spas shall be located in the rear half of the lot. Due to the small number of residential properties with limited space in rear yards, staff proposes that swimming pools and spas be allowed within the street side yards or corner lots where space is provided. And lastly, moving on to the 3 housing element programs, starting with emergency shelter parking. So emergency shelters, in this case, our intent is to reduce the parking constraints for shelters for every 10 parking spaces, for example, or one adult bed, we'd require 10 parking spaces. In terms of the definition of family, this is really to clarify the definition to ensure it's more inclusive of all family types. We received direction from the Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, on this particular definition. And lastly, farm worker housing. And the intent really is to allow farm worker housing by right in the agricultural zone, or AG zone. The action this evening is to adopt the requested Planning Commission resolution recommending that the City Council adopt ordinance Title 17 of the Municipal Code regarding the items and their sections presented here tonight. This concludes my presentation, but I'll open it up for any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome to the city.
Thank you so much.
Before I open it up for public comment, are there any commissioners wishing to ask questions? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to start at the end. Commissioner DeAnda?
Thank you, Chair Berliner. I was just looking for a little bit of clarification on the wind turbine component. I mean, I support that. Can you tell me how, you mentioned that they don't, if they don't exceed the height requirements for that zone, so within the current structure height limits, or are there special limits for that? I mean,
Well, yeah, so each residential zone, thank you for the question, Commissioner. Each residential zone has a height limit requirement. For example, in the R1 zone, it's 30 feet. So it would not be allowed to reach the 30-foot limit in that.
okay, so if you had like a 2-story home that was, I don't know what they average out, but you may not be able to put it on the top. Could you put it in as a freestanding thing, or?
Yeah, I mean, it would be allowed on other structures. So
Okay.
yeah, if theoretically, if you had another structure that would be under that height limit, and you'd like to place it there, we would consider that.
And would that be the only kind of restriction in terms of allowing it? Would there be any kind of other limits on the number of turbines that you could have, or the types of turbines, any other?
Well, I think in terms of how we've presented this, it's really just the small residential turbines.
Okay.
We didn't put a cap on the limit to them, but you know, a lot of that would be worked out on the building permit side. As we have you know, presented this would not go through a planning design review, but building permits would still be applicable in that case.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Moving on to Commissioner Esquivel.
Yes, thank you. First and foremost, wonderful written analysis. As someone who doesn't live and breathe this on an everyday basis, it was very well written, clear to understand. And then when you complemented it with your PowerPoint presentations and the photos, I just want to thank you, and I really, really appreciate the work that was put into this. One of my questions comes from the swimming pools, and I'm just wondering if there has been any residential or any residents that have come forward to the city in terms of trying to build a backyard or a pool on the side of their house, given the challenges of not being able to build behind in the rear end of their house. So have there been any residents that have come forward expressing those concerns?
Yeah, Commissioner, very good question. Yes, so we've had at least one person come to the planning division requesting a pool be located on the corner. Yeah, the configurations of their lot would really prevent them from building on the rear side. They just have a very narrow rear setback, and it would allow for a little bit more space if they would have placed it on the corner lot, but due to the current section of the code, that wouldn't be allowed. So I noted there's a small number. I'm sure there are other properties that may be eligible. I've certainly seen them in my research, that if they were to potentially ask for this would allow them a little bit more leeway in terms of working with that, as some of the properties just have now much smaller rear setbacks. Corner lots, well, not many of them, there's still enough for us to really consider this as a potential amendment.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the key on that, this one, is that the pools would still need to be fully fenced in and enclosed, in that regard. That's a standard requirement in the building code. I think it's at least 5.5 feet, I think, but so a standard, 6-foot, property line fence is sufficient for that, and this particular proposal wouldn't change that at all. That's the main thing here is safety, and so they still will need to be fenced properly.
Yeah, and another addition to that is that there would be no building of a pool or spa within a public easement. And that's very important when you're talking about corner lots and their placement. So we would prohibit any construction of a pool or spa over a public easement.
Thank you. And then my second question is under the farm worker on page 5, seeing that you have a reference to the California Labor Code when it comes to the definition of farm worker. I don't see that same reference when it came to the farm worker dwelling unit and the farm worker housing. I'm curious as to how that definition came about. Was there any other references that were used to develop the definition of this?
Yeah, thank you for that, Commissioner. That question, Commissioner. Yeah, we utilize the California Health and Safety Code for farm worker housing, and we also did some research in terms of other municipalities and jurisdictions within Yolo County, and I used a good example from the city of Winters for that specific those specific definitions, and so that's where we applied it, and I think it meets the intent of what that amendment.
Thank you. And to me, I'll just share that I do come from a farm worker background and family, so this really stood out, and it was important for me just to have a better understanding. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Of course, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Esquivel. Moving down the line, Vice Chair Lockhart.
Thank you, Chair Berliner. Yes, thank you again for your presentation and the report. It definitely helped in the decision-making process here. I wanted to continue some questioning about the wind turbines. Could you just explain the difference between by right and other permitting processes and what that would entail?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Vice Chair. Yes, so by right would essentially permit any use from being placed on a particular lot or property. So for example, we have in the R1 district, a single family home is permitted by right, would not need to go through a design review process. So in this case, when we're talking about wind turbines, because we acknowledge the value that they may have in terms of providing more alternative forms of energy, we felt like this would be a permitted by right use, not having to go through a planning division review process and simply only having to go through a building permit process. Now, there's no guarantee that they get through the building permit process, and certainly planning division staff has the ability to review during that process, but it would not go through a design review process, and that would sort of give them or give the applicant an opportunity to maybe expedite the review process.
So I'm just trying to understand, like I certainly appreciate the goal of the city's climate goals and achieving that and bottling our amazing Delta breeze that cools us off at night. But my concern is, thinking in my neighborhood, there was a rare bird that was at the lakes, and people came, it made front page news in the news ledger. People came from all over to look at this bird. I think about the causeway and all the bats that live under the causeway and how they feed on the insects in West Sacramento. And I just have a concern about if wind turbines are easily permitted, how are we protecting these important species in our city?
It's a very good question. I think it's something that we could certainly study more if that's the desire of the commission. But I think what we've heard from, at least from staff, is that they are a benefit as opposed to being kind of a negative to residential properties. And we think it's important to move it forward, but certainly we're open to having more discussions if need be.
Would that go, would environmental considerations of wildlife be taken in consideration in the building permit process?
Maybe I can.
So no, we don't typically do environmental assessment for building permits, but we do have an EIR on our general plan. And so alternative energy sources were already analyzed as part of the general plan. So we have broadly looked at this issue already in that context as far as environmental impacts. And then was there still any confusion on the by right question, or? Because generally speaking, just by right just means something is allowed without further discretionary review. So if somebody wants currently to put solar on their house, there's no discretionary review of that approval. They go in for a building permit, and then whatever the building permit requirements for solar installation are, that's what staff evaluates that proposal against. And what staff's proposing here would essentially put the wind turbines on the same level as solar, as far as that level of review. I think that's all I've got right now.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. And then I had a question about the parking and the housing element as well. I understand the 1 per 10 beds moving up from 5, but was also curious how there was priority given to a manager for the shelter, but would that impact the people who work at the shelter as well? Is it your opinion that would be adequate parking for people who don't live at the shelter but work there?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Vice Chair, thank you. We actually discussed this with housing staff, and we felt, in coordination that yes, it would the change from 5 to 10 would be adequate, plus the 1 additional parking space for a manager on site. So we think that is an adequate number. The intent obviously is to lessen the restraints on parking, considering there's emergency shelters are something that we want to make sure that we're consistently looking at and improving the process for development.
Then just as a follow-up to that, it said in the analysis that the city compared it to local cities, I think Davis and Winters.
Right.
But it didn't specify what their ratios were. Is it the same as you're proposing?
I think from what we've seen is that the other jurisdictions actually had, there were some that were a little bit more strict and some that are a little bit more lax in that case. Some that didn't even mention the number of beds per number of parking spaces per adult beds. So we, in conversations with staff, we felt like we couldn't necessarily eliminate that, so we'd want to go ahead and just make sure it was doubled to the point where this was a feasible ask, as opposed to changing the entire definition.
Thank you so much.
And if I could just add to that briefly, the change in the parking requirement comes from a comment from HCD on our housing element to lower the burden of parking for this use, to basically bring it down to equivalent levels of other uses in the same zone where this use takes place. So HCD didn't give us a strict number to follow, but staff basically looked at an analysis of comparable uses within the same areas. That's basically where that number comes from.
Yeah, and this is really an attempt at the state level to make sure that some of the bad actors out there are not, even though everyone is required to have allow emergency shelters by right in at least one zoning district, if they say, okay, you can have a shelter, but you have to have 500 parking spaces for it, which they never would be able to do. It's sort of an indirect way to try to get around some of those mandates. And obviously these types of facilities are always controversial. There's no doubt about that. But at the state level, this is something we had to, a couple of housing elements ago, we had to put into our zoning code as a by right use. And then we added a couple of zoning rounds ago, we added the daytime shelters. So this is another aspect where, we need to make sure we're following state law, but I feel like this may have been targeted at some of the more bad actors out there and not necessarily us. And there aren't any, shelters, being proposed or even considered, at this time that I'm aware of. But if one ever did, we want to make sure that we're following the law on that. We don't want to get ourselves in trouble on that. So I think that's really what was behind that legislation. Since they were forced to allow them by right, some folks can figure other creative ways to indirectly prohibit these types of facilities.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Commissioner Sablon.
Thank you, Chair Berliner, and welcome to the city, and thank you for the great presentation. I, too, have concerns about the wind turbines. Let's see, is there a way to define wind turbine specifically so it limits it in size and placement? I guess it can't go above 30 feet or whatever the height limit is in the zoned area. But I guess I feel it seems too broad to me the way it's currently posed. I definitely support alternative energy and more climate-friendly energy sources. I feel like it needs to be more restrictive, though, in allowing it by right, given that a building permit is ministerial and we won't have further review. Are there building regulations that specify sizes for wind turbines?
Thank you for your question, Commissioner. I don't know if there are specific building regulations for those. We'd have to look into that. And we certainly acknowledge your concerns, and I think it's something that, again, if the commission decides that we need a little bit more clarity when it comes to wind turbines, we're certainly more than willing to explore that out.
Okay, and then I guess also building on Vice Chair Lockhart's comment about the birds and environmental impact on that, if there are certain wind turbines that have mitigation measures on it that prevent birds from getting stuck in there. I think since COVID, I've seen a lot more birds. I don't know if there's been more birds around because I'm home more, working from home, but it's nice to see those birds around, and I could see that having an impact on the birds. And I know our council has said there has been some study related to this in the general plan EIR. I think I wouldn't feel comfortable going forward with this without seeing that EIR analysis. So if that's something we can include, or if we could get a copy of, I know that's available
Just to be
online.
clear, I don't think we looked at wind turbines specifically in the EIR. We just looked at alternative energy sources more generally. So we really just have a very broad overview of this so far.
Okay, so I think getting more information on environmental impacts associated with this would if that's available.
No,
Yeah,
thank you.
and
Thank you for-
staff wouldn't, if it would be the commission's preference to perhaps move on the other items and not on this one at this time, that's certainly something that we could entertain and do some more homework on the wind turbine concept, if that would be the pleasure of the commission.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure if that was a question, that last part, sorry about that.
No, thank you for noting that.
Commissioner Steger.
Thank you so much. And all of my questions, I think, have been covered now. And so, again, to echo everyone, thank you very much for this comprehensive report. It was very easy to follow, and I was excited to see that the city is open to these amendments and to improve some of these policies. And so, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And really to reiterate, these are periodic. So we want to make sure we're coming before the Planning Commission on a semi-regular basis. We in working through this and looking at potential amendments and changes, we have a list, a long list that we hope to incorporate and we hope to potentially even build upon. So as I mentioned before, the code is a living document. We want to make sure, we include these process improvements from time to time. And yeah, we hope to come back maybe in the near future to present even more. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think Commissioner Hirsch has some questions.
Yes, thank you, Chair Berliner, and thank you, Mr. Berruman, for the presentation. You're doing great for your first time presenting to the Planning Commission and getting a very hot bench. But I did have one additional question. Some of my other questions have been asked already. For the applicability section, where it looks like we're exempting city-owned properties from the provisions of the municipal code, I was just hoping if you could elaborate. Is this kind of change, or is that kind of exemption common in other cities? And if so, what's the history of this not having already been in place here in West Sacramento?
Yeah, and maybe I can speak a little bit to that, and then maybe David and Andreas could follow up. But from my understanding is this is fairly common practice with other jurisdictions, and that this change is actually meant to sort of effectuate something that was done previously. And so what we've intended with this amendment is to really kind of go back and more of a cleanup to say this is what the intent of this applicability section is really all about.
Thank you.
And just to add to that, yes, it's a very common practice throughout the state for jurisdictions to exempt themselves from their zoning regulations. It's not something novel that we're doing here. And as Daniel said, this is something that the city had previously done, but that had been changed due to the past administrations.
Thank you.
Thank you. I actually have no questions because every topic has, other than the pools and spas, has been covered very thoroughly. I do want to open up the public hearing. No, I'm going to open up the public hearing and then we'll, yeah. Okay. I'm going to open up the public hearing, but seeing that there are no members of the public with,
There are no public comments.
there are no public comments, I will send it back over to Vice Chair Lockhart.
Sorry, I forgot to ask one additional question related to the paving component. Could you just speak to the fact that, my microphone on? My question relates to the paving component. We're in a drought. We're asking residents to remove landscaping, to use more drought-tolerant landscaping. How does this apply to making sure, I mean, it says paving, so can you put in pavers and large tiles, terracotta? I just want to understand that a little better, if you could help illuminate that.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Commissioner Lockhart. Yeah, the intent is really to make sure, first, it's the current definitions, it's open to open interpretation. So we wanted to clarify that and be very specific, and the changes there are fairly specific in terms of the R1, R2, R2.5. And what we wanted to go ahead and do is, yes, we understand, obviously, there's we're in California. There's a drought situation here, and that we've seen here, recently and potentially in the foreseeable future. But the intent really is for a balance of front yards. We don't want an entirely paved front yard. We want, wherever possible, the use of low impact development, practices, the use of drought tolerant vegetation, which you brought up. And that be incorporated, that be part of the approach when someone is proposing a residential development, that they don't have an entirely paved, impermeable, ground cover. We feel like, for another aspect of how to deal with disaster mitigation or emergency management, is that's the flooding issue. And so whenever we have pervious pavement and it's something that we can incorporate and make sure is part of the equation when we're talking about capturing water on site, as opposed to it streaming off and into the open waterways. We want to make sure that there's that aspect there. So it's part of the solution, and what we wanted to do with this particular section is be a little bit more clear about how we want to incorporate that. Use of pavers is important. That's the side of the actually the pervious or the impervious. That's where the pavers can be used, but the impervious should be more vegetation and other non-paved surfaces.
Yeah. This first came up maybe about 10 years ago. We started to see a rash of people paving over their entire front yards to essentially to park boats and RVs. And we got some direction at that time from the council to, we really don't want that. So we are, as Daniel said, trying to clarify this a little bit. People have, many options here. We've seen many people do pervious pavers. They mostly have their driveway, and then the rest of it is, grasses, mulch. You even see people just put rocks in, and as long as the rocks aren't concreted and fused together, it's still pervious. So that's the key here, is maintaining that level of pervious material in the front yard for a variety of reasons, but a lot of what Daniel said about some of the drainage and groundwater recharge. But also to make sure that people aren't parking boats and RVs. We had that where people would pull them in the driveway and then park them parallel to the street, and then you couldn't even see the house anymore. That wasn't thought to be a desirable outcome in a neighborhood. So this does come up from time to time, code enforcement issues and things. But for the most part, at 50%, it still gives people quite a bit of leeway, even after you account for a driveway. In the front yard. And once you're outside your front yard setback, which tends to be anywhere between 10 and 15 feet, you can still do whatever you want. So it seems to be a balance, and it seems to have been working. But I do think that some clarification there would be beneficial for staff and our residents, and then the code enforcement officers who are out there pounding the pavement, pardon the pun there, with this particular topic. But it has worked, and it has been beneficial, I think, and we've avoided some of those other outcomes that are not desirable. Full-blown, paving in front of houses and things I think so far, at least, we found that that's not desirable for the majority of residents.
Thank you. So, because there's no public comment, I'm going to go ahead and close the public hearing. And I'll bring it back to the commissioners for discussion. Go ahead.
So I think all the changes are good and needed to update to be consistent with all our new housing laws. And I'm just really uncomfortable with the wind turbines provision. So I would propose taking that out, tabling that for now, with maybe we could give direction to staff on what we'd like to see more of for that, or if we're not on board with that, or whatever that direction may be. I'm just uncomfortable with that right now.
Okay. So would you say removing that part from the resolution and asking for more information about the environmental impacts of wind turbines?
Yeah, and propose definitions for wind turbines, because I think I also imagine like some 30-foot thing going up off of, if you have a single-story home and going up to 30 feet, I think that would also be undesirable, both aesthetically and for birds and such. So I think some limitations, more defined limitations on what is allowed by right.
Okay. Sorry, I'm left-handed, so I keep looking to the left, but I want to make sure that I'm not ignoring the people on my right.
I just want to say that I agree with Commissioner Sablon that I'm satisfied with the responses that we've received from staff about every other component that we're considering tonight. Again, just really big concerns about the unique wildlife that we have in our community, and wouldn't want us to inadvertently meet one environmental goal and then hurt another. And then also the design component is very important to me too. It was said that these are like solar panels, but solar panels are flat to the roof. A lot of times the way the roof angles are, you can't even really see them from the street. And after seeing the pictures in the presentation, there's quite a wide variety of turbines that are available. And so I agree that we should consider the environmental impacts to wildlife, and then also the aesthetic considerations for neighborhoods.
Thank you. Moving along over here. Okay.
So if I could jump in briefly, just to anticipate what might come up for the motion.
Yeah.
The motion would be to move staff's recommended action, but striking from the resolution the references to the wind turbines and also removing that section from the ordinance.
Yes.
We needed both removed from the ordinance and the resolution. Be clear about that.
Okay. Okay, we have a motion by Commissioner Sablon.
I can state that. So I move staff recommendation with striking the wind turbines from the resolution and the ordinance.
Second.
And we have a second from Vice Chair Lockhart. Madam Clerk, can you call the roll?
Commissioner Steger,
Aye.
Commissioner Sablon,
Aye.
Commissioner Hirsch,
Aye.
Commissioner Escobar,
Aye.
Commissioner DeAnda,
Aye.
Vice Chair Lockhart,
Aye.
Chair Berliner.
Aye. Motion passes. I do want to ask that we do get more information about the environmental impacts of wind turbines as well as definitions for future meetings. Be awesome. Thank you. Okay. Moving on to the administrative function part 2. Are there any commissioner communications? I would actually like to say thank you to Commissioner Esquivel for having this effort. I don't know if anyone's noticed, but we're, for the most part, all wearing pink in honor of Breast Cancer Awareness Month. And I just want to thank Commissioner Esquivel for rallying the troops and getting us, to raise this awareness. With that, I guess we'll adjourn.